hopefully, once we spent a couple of weeks here looking at all the commentary, the context, the word clues, the prophetic connections with the fig tree and its associated prophecy, the grapevine, then when we get to Matthew 24, it might make a little more sense rather than starting with Matthew 24, where Yeshua is pretty much talking to an audience that already has a context. It's not brand new. We tend to give new converts a little New Testament with the Gospels, and a lot of times this is the first of the word they've ever read. It might be a first of the word they've ever heard, and we're starting them in the Gospels, where in the first century there's already a long history in Israel and Judah of understandings surrounding the Torah, the prophets, the writings, and there's a whole body of extra biblical literature devoted to commenting upon those books. So that's part of their not just their religious life, it's part of their culture. I mean, their cultural stories are biblical related stories. And we don't have experience with that for the most part. If we're in a Western culture, it's kind of been separated for us. There's the stories we had to learn in high school, the Greek and the Roman mythology, and the American literature or world literature or whatever literature you had to learn. But for the most part, it was pretty well separated from any religious literature. Maybe if you went, through certain eras of literature, they might have had some connection to what was going on in terms of religious movements at that particular time. But it's going to be really difficult sometimes for us in this Western world to see how intricately intertwined Judaism's literature is with the scriptures, and their culture is with the scriptures. And that's why it's scary sometimes for people outside the culture, outside of Judaism. It's seen as a little scary because it's something we're not familiar with, and things we're not familiar with do tend to scare us, and we tend to be very leery of it, especially if you've had that cold reading, is what I call it, of the Gospels. I don't think we should be giving new converts cold readings of the Gospels. I mean, that's like a cold call. You're jumping in, 4,000 years into the story instead of starting. It's like, why would you give somebody a book 3/4 of the way and say, don't start reading until you get this far into the book and then start reading? And it'll tell you everything you need to know. And I'm like, no, we don't do that. That's not good practice. We don't do that to our children. We teach our children to start at the beginning of the book. And then, I mean, it's not that we haven't peaked at the end. Of course we do. Some of us, we might be serial last chapter readers. That's fine. But for the most part, we start at the beginning and we work to the end, and we can have these layers of understanding. And so a lot of times this cold reading of the Gospels, it completely rips it out of the context and the people that would have been listening and understood so much more than we do outside the culture, outside the religion was not the same. There were Judaisms, not Judaism. There were Judaisms of the first century, but even within that, there's the formation of these ways of reading scripture and the stories surrounding these readings of scripture that we would call midrash, which are basically teaching stories. And so we're not to take them as literally true. They could be, but we're not supposed to take them like scripture. They are supposed to elucidate what we're reading in scripture. And so that's why I'm hoping to circle back. That was a long way of saying it. I'm hoping to circle back to Matthew 24 so that we can understand with a fresh mind, but now with a background of what Yeshua's listeners, the people listening to him, what would they have brought to the table when he said, pay attention to the parable of the fig tree? They could have brought these things to the table that we're learning this couple of weeks. So that's why I want to save Matthew 24 for last, if that makes sense. To me, we learn more that way than the cold call. Hello, this is Matthew. Let me tell you the gospel. Not that that hasn't worked. It does work. But if we can do something better, why not do it better? So let's share the screen. And what I want to do too, even if you haven't had a chance to listen to last night's recording, I'm going to go back to a certain section in last night's lesson. In the after class, Scott Harwell brought up Ezekiel 20 as a commentary on the wilderness, where, remember, in Revelation, we saw there's 2 trips to the wilderness, and it's the woman. And so we're left to kind of decipher, like I said, cold calling Revelation. We're left to kind of decipher, well, why is there the woman riding the beast? Why is she in the wilderness? But also the virtuous woman who has the testimony of Yeshua, the commandments of God, her children, why are they in the wilderness? Why are they both in the wilderness? I think that chapter that he brought up can shed even more light on the testing in the wilderness. I'm going to back up to there, and then we'll jump over in today's lesson. So I think there's 3 slides that I added to last night. And play it from current. There we go. Okay, so I don't know if Scott's up in a tree hunting right now, but if he is, then thank you, Scott. And when you come out of the tree, take a look at this in Ezekiel 20:33. And I just took a passage because our context last night, what I was trying to point out was, if you're saying, how do I get ready for this wilderness you're telling me that I'm going to be in, if I'm not already in it? How do I prepare for that practically? Practically Shabbat. And if you look at the context here of Ezekiel 20, it's about Shabbat in the middle of these judgments and prophecies, so forth. In the middle of it, he's saying Shabbat, Shabbat, Shabbat. And that's what I was saying, Shabbat, Shabbat. Practically, what is going to increase your ability to walk in faith in the wilderness rather than decrease it? Because once you get out there, you'll either increase or decrease. That's where Yeshua is, I think, saying it's bad to be lukewarm in the wilderness. You really need to have chosen a position. Don't hop back and forth. So here's the passage that I pulled out of there, because it does concern the wilderness. And our question of, well, I doubt he's going to pull us all out and stick us down in the Negev desert in the southern part of Israel, or they're at that border with Egypt and Israel. I doubt if he's going to gather us all literally in that place, although he could. We don't discount that. But is there another kind of wilderness like the rabbis were talking about last night, where it's more of a withdrawal from society because it becomes so grievous? And in that sense, we may already have entered a wilderness consciously and said, you know what, there's nothing out there in the world that is going to support me like the one who created me. And if I have to disconnect and unplug from these systems that I've depended upon, that I thought were okay, were sure, were true, were fair, good intentions, I may identify some of these systems that I've been leaning too hard upon. And you may have already started unplugging. That can create a wilderness in itself. And so in Ezekiel, it says, as I live, declares the Lord God, and he does, with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm and with wrath poured out. I think this connects us again with the wrath of the Lamb in Revelation. What's happening? It's related to the wilderness. You can't tell that story without bringing in the wilderness journey. And of course, we've been talking about the 3 days and the 3 nights of darkness as being linked, the 9th plague to the 10th, the plague of the firstborn, which actually kind of births Israel is able to, at that point, arise, my love, and depart from Egypt. So the 9th and the 10th are linked. There was a prejudgment in the 3 days and the 3 nights of darkness. If you had light in those 3 days and 3 nights, then it was a pretty good indication you were going to be part of that Exodus. So he says, with wrath poured out, I assuredly shall be king over you. I will bring you out from the peoples. Okay, we're switching from Egypt to the peoples. I will bring you out from the peoples and gather you from the lands where you are scattered. So there's a bringing out first and a gathering. Those can be the same step, but they could be 2 steps. That again, you will begin to unplug from the people group with which you've always identified. You will begin to unplug from those systems. And once you are unplugged from those systems, then it could be that a process of gathering begins. In fact, one will probably lead to the other. I can't imagine that as you unplug from this system, that uppermost in your mind would be just isolating yourself, completely alone in a desert or on a mountain somewhere. So from that point, you will start to look for like kind and like mind. So we've been scattered out into the lands. He says, I'm going to bring you out and I'm going to gather you with a mighty hand and with an outstretched arm and with wrath poured out. So twice he says wrath. I will bring you into the wilderness of the peoples. That's what got my attention, the wilderness of the peoples, because Egypt and the prophets, although it represents in a very specific way the realm of death to the Israelites, there is an added symbolism there because it does represent the peoples. So he says, a wilderness of the peoples, just like I brought you in and began to gather you, because at one point in Egypt, they were scattered out there. Remember, they had to scatter out and find the straw in their tribulation. And at some point, he begins to gather them in. He says, I'm going to bring you into a wilderness of the peoples. It's going to be maybe, it'll have characteristics of a literal wilderness. It'll be more isolated. Maybe without all the conveniences of town. But nevertheless, this is something that can be accomplished, I believe, among the peoples. You can be in a wilderness among the peoples. And he says, there, I will enter into judgment with you face to face, just as I entered into judgment with your fathers in the wilderness of the land of Egypt. So there's a wilderness of the land of Egypt, and then there's a wilderness they spent 40 years in between Egypt and the promised land. So he's saying there was a pre-wilderness before there was a wilderness. There was a wilderness in the land of Egypt. There was a separation already taking place during the 10 plagues. And even though the whole theme of Passover is the judgments on Egypt, the subtext is also telling us there's a judgment on Israel as well. Because as you read on there was a reluctance to give up their idols, not directed at the Egyptians. This is directed at the Israelites. The Israelites had taken on idols. That's why they so easily fell into the golden calf. Some of them, they might have initially said, oh yeah, we'll give this up. But then when times got hard, the idolatry had not been completely uprooted. So there was a pre-wilderness. He's calling this the wilderness of the land of Egypt. He says, so I will enter into judgment with you. And if you remember, those first plagues affected the Israelites just as much as the Egyptians. There was a judgment taking place with Israel. And if we were to believe the rabbis, the 9th plague, the plague of darkness, also affected the Israelites, but in a much more subtle way. He says, I will make you pass under the rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. And you say, wait a minute, what if I'm already in the bond of the covenant? Well, look how many times this covenant is renewed just in the Torah. See, when there's a return, When you've been out there in exile, when you've been out there scattered, when you've made huge errors, he might call you back in to renew the bond of the covenant. And it might take different forms. It might take the form of the blood on the doorposts and the lintel. It might take the form of Mount Sinai. It might take the form of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. At different places in the journey, there might be a renewal of the bond of covenant. So he says there will be a judgment at this time. And you're going to pass under the rod, which is how you counted sheep. They passed under your rod. You would count so many sheep under the rod. And this is, by the way, it's associated with the Feast of Trumpets. This is very particular language that's associated with the Feast of Trumpets because it has to do with accounting and reckoning that takes place. And so in this time of judgment in Egypt, or the wilderness judgment of Egypt, he says, I will purge you from the rebels and those who revolt against me. I will purge from you the rebels and those who revolt against me. In other words, those who have an identity with Israel, there will be some among that group who nevertheless rebel and revolt. And so here's what he says about them. I will bring them out of the land where they reside, just like you had a remnant brought out of Egypt, but they will not enter the land of Israel. Same condition. This is our telescope we were talking about last night. Has it happened before? Yes. Will it happen again? Yes. And it will happen at different points in history. And he says, so you will know that I am the Lord. In other words, when this happens, you're going to be able to identify this pattern, not just because the prophet said this would happen, but because you can look back at the original prophecy in the Torah and say, this happened before. There were 10 plagues in which, yes, even Israel fell under judgment in those 10 plagues. Eventually, there became a distinction. It looks like 10 plagues, if you think about it. Why did it take 10? Well, 10 is a significant number, but aside from that, think of a people who have been in slavery. They're probably not going to watch Charlton Heston in the 10 Commandments and be inspired and just leave Egypt. It's not that easy. They can be killed. They're dwelling in the midst of the most powerful army on earth at that point. They're under complete control. They've got the mind of a slave. And so just saying, okay, Moses is here, let's go, guys, that's not the way it happens. In fact, you just watch. I want to see when Yeshua comes back, how many people are trying to process, like, do I really want to leave here right now? You know, I have a vacation scheduled at Disneyland. It's just, people get so focused on the here and now, they fail to see those opportunities of freedom sometimes. And so this purging takes place, I believe, one by one, and it gives the Israelites 10 chances to come out from that mindset of a slave. But at the very same time, what Ezekiel's telling us is there was also an element of rebellion. There were people who saw the opportunity to be free. There was going to be a covenant. There was going to be requirements. But they looked at that opportunity to be free and they rebelled against the conditions of the covenant. And that's why he says, I'm going to, where'd it go? I will bring you into the bond of covenant. And then what happens? He's going to offer this bond of covenant again, and people are going to rise up and rebel, and they're going to revolt, and they're going to say, no, not that word, not that covenant. And we're used to dealing with that. We deal with that all the time. People tell us there's whole parts of the Bible that just don't apply to us anymore. And in some cases they don't. If it's a farmer commandment, you're not a farmer in the land of Israel, it doesn't apply to you. You're still responsible to learn it. But unless you have land in the land of Israel, there's going to be certain commandments you can't keep. If you're a female, then you can't keep the male commandments. If you're male, you don't keep the female commandments. In that sense, they would not apply, but they apply to your community. They apply to your family. But he says, I want to bring you into this bond of covenant. And what's going to happen? People will rebel against it. And that's why it's so important to stay focused on it is written instead of I feel. Because as you get into these doctrines, these theologies, often what you find is the words aren't even in the Bible that you've been taught. And so you will revolt and say, wait a minute, what somebody told me is weightier and heavier than what the word is saying. And so he says, for that group of people, there's going to be this group, just expect it. They're going to strip the life out of the word, or try to, they can't, but they will rebel and revolt. He says, I'll bring them out of the land where they reside, but they will not enter the land of Israel. It doesn't mean they're not part of Israel. It means that they're not ready to enter the land of Israel. Joshua and Caleb were ready to enter. Just about everybody else was not ready to enter the land of Israel. They had constant rebellions and revolts against the words of Moses. And he's just the messenger. He's just the mouthpiece. So in terms of the wilderness, I hope that passage, thank you, Scott, that passage really kind of brings out, I think, more vividly what the rabbis were saying is there's a kind of a pre-wilderness where you make a conscious choice to reach for freedom instead of to be happy with the comfort, with the security you think there is in slavery to Egypt or Mystery Babylon. And it's all about offering what you want. It's all about giving you what your appetite calls for. It's all about the appetite. It's all going to go back to Edom and the beast. And even the reason we put a mezuzah on the door, the reason the blood had to go on the doorpost or the mezuzot, it's all going to go back to Edom. And then Edom is going to take us back to a tree in the garden, because of the appetite that drove that whole interaction with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It's going to be the mezuzah. In the case of the Passover, the blood on the doorpost. And then later he says, write these on your mezuzot, write them on the doorposts of your house, the commandments. See, if you put the commandments on your doorpost, at least the outward sign is, I agree with the bond of covenant. I want to live under the bond of covenant. There are people who want to be called by the name Israel, or they want to be called children of Abraham, but they do not want to live under the bond of covenant. If they're not willing to do that, and the whole purpose of the wilderness test, he says, I wanted to test you to see what was in your heart, to see if you would obey my commandments or not. And if not, it didn't mean you weren't an Israelite, but it did mean you weren't going to cross over the Jordan. There was a place for you, but it wasn't in the land of Israel. He did not strip your identity. He stripped your inheritance to live in that elevated place. And so in these withdrawals, you're passing under the rod, and he's going to check your doorposts. Are you willing to live under the bond of covenant or not? Let's see, is this what I just said? I think pretty much this is what I just said. This wilderness of the peoples mirroring the Egyptian wilderness of reckoning. This wilderness is going to be created through wrath. In other words, maybe we wouldn't have willingly or intentionally withdrawn into a wilderness, begun to separate ourselves from the grievousness of sin in Babylon. But the conditions of the wrath of the Lamb, we begin to hear the footsteps. We begin to see the wrath of the Lamb around the earth. And that's what you see all over the earth right now is anger. Everybody's angry. They're either angry or afraid. And if you're angry, any psychologist will tell you it starts with being afraid. You're probably not angry before you were afraid. You were afraid, and then it morphs into anger. With the wrath of the Lamb, you're experiencing pure wrath. Yeshua is not afraid. That's the difference. With a human, it goes from fear to wrath. With Yeshua, it's the pure emotion of wrath. And so because we start to see the effects of the wrath around the earth, the anger that's playing out all around us, we are going to begin to withdraw because of the grievousness of sin. That's how we withdraw into this wilderness. And he says, okay, it's not over here. Just the fact that you noticed how bad the world was and began to withdraw, that's not the end. It's kind of the beginning. It's the beginning of the reckoning. Just withdrawing from blatant sin, not that big a deal, right? Even Lot was grieved. It says he was vexed by the filthy conversation of the Sodomites. Okay, just because you sit and watch a movie and they drop an F-bomb and that grieves you, you say, well, I can't watch this movie. Well, that doesn't make you righteous. Maybe as righteous as Lot. We'll give it that much. But unless you're willing to turn it off, I guess, then I don't know that you've done any better than Lot did. The angels had to go fetch him because he would sit there day after day and listen to the filthy conversation, even though it was vexing him. So there's a vexation that says, let me get away from here. And at that point, once you have kind of withdrawn and started to unplug from the filthiness of society, he says, now's when judgment starts for you. Like, again, cheer up, it gets worse. You're going to pass under the rod. And that particular phrase is associated with Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah. That's the day of judgment. Now, the judgment is not sealed over until Yom HaKippurim, 10 days later. And then during Sukkot, the sealed judgment is handed off to be executed. So it seems to be that we have to be prepared in the spring and the Passover. And Yeshua makes these references to summer. Like, summer is near when you see this. Summer's going to be bad. That's what the assembly at Thyatira is told. Unless you repent, you're going to be thrown into great tribulation. Summer's here, and summer's going to be bad. Not this summer. I mean, it could be, but in general, in the prophecy. And so what would happen, this is the way it's associated in the Mishnah. It talks about how at the Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, that the entire world, not just Israel, the entire world, it is said, passes under the shepherd's rod for accounting, for reckoning. Every person in the world has the decrees recorded. What's going to happen in the coming year. It's sealed up 10 days later, and then the execution of those decrees begins during Sukkot. And that explains a little bit of why the Egyptians hated shepherds, because remember, they worshiped sheep. They made a god out of sheep. Well, in the Hebrew version of this story, it's the sheep who pass under the rod for reckoning, for the resurrection, because the Feast of Trumpets is associated with the resurrection of the dead, the greater body of Messiah resurrecting at that time. There's the preliminary resurrection experienced at Passover that we see with Yeshua during the Passover week, but then the greater body of Messiah is expected to resurrect at the Feast of Trumpets. So they pass under the shepherd's rod, and if they are reckoned, if they are accounted for righteousness, then they will be resurrected at that time. But as they pass under the rod, if the judgment is, no, you're not ready to go into the land, then we find out that it's not the sheep who are God, that there actually is a great shepherd of the sheep. And so this is what sheep do. They worship themselves. If sheep are people, we worship our own will. That's what a pagan god does. You go to the pagan god of your choice because he'll give you what you want. That's just worshiping yourself and using something else as the object, but it's actually worshiping your own will. On Yom Teruah, what we find out is we are not gods. And we have a finite amount of time to be our own gods. Because when we pass under the rod, eventually a decree will come, you will die. You will die this year. Or a decree will come, you know what, your mortal body may die this year, but you are not going to taste death. And we're going to look at that next week. What does it mean to taste death? Why is our experience of death different from the rich man's? Why do certain people taste it, but other people will never taste it, even if they are dead? It has to do with the reckoning, going under the shepherd's rod. So this wilderness of the people, his kind of pulling you out into the wilderness, saying, unhook from these systems first. And once you get out there, guess what? I'm going to judge you. But I think it's better than being judged with the nations, right? Because at least this way you don't lose your identity. Maybe you've got some things all wrong here, but at least you still identify as a believer rather than saying, I'm Hungarian first, I'm German first, I'm American first, I'm, Swiss first, and then I'm a believer second. No, he says, I want you got to get this first part right. You have to know who you are. And then once you've identified, you've separated out of Mystery Babylon, the confusion of the nations, they're going to have their judgment for sure. You don't want to be with them. You want to be judged as an Israelite, because even if that judgment doesn't turn out so well, you still haven't lost your identity. Even if you fall in the wilderness, you're still an Israelite. It might affect how you're resurrected. And we'll look at that. We don't know for sure, but we get some hints about where those fallen Israelites might be in the resurrection. Still with an identity, but not prepared to enter the land. So there's a pruning that's going to take place in this wilderness, is what Ezekiel is saying. If you're a rebel, if you're a rabble rouser, he's going to prune you away. He's not going to let you enter into the land. So it's not being home free. You can still get out in that wilderness and revolt and behave badly. But the remnant that's left is going to be renewed in a bond of covenant, and they will enter the land. And I believe this is the land that Abraham saw. I believe this is the elevated land, the land that we were created to inherit, with a body that's a resurrected body that's equally able to function at a natural physical level and a spiritual level, with equal sharp vision. Right now, we have to lift our eyes in order to see into that place. There won't be that veil between us. So practically, what is this saying? Revelation 20, verse 6 says, blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death has no power. But they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him for 1,000 years. And this is on earth. For them, it appears it's a resurrected life, and there is a realm of the land of Israel that the average person can't engage completely. they might still have a limited vision as it pertains to that place. I think that's where Yeshua was going in and out of when he would just disappear on people and hide himself. I think he was just able to walk into that realm. It didn't mean he wasn't right there in the crowd. It just meant they couldn't see him. So for those who fall in the wilderness, they still have that I'm an Israelite identity, but I'm also a rebel. But better to be a rebel Israelite than a rebel non-Israelite, right? So he says, if you make it under the shepherd's rod, at the Feast of Trumpets, at the resurrection, if you're resurrected from the dead at that moment, in the wilderness, then it seems like John is saying, you were one of those who has a part in the first resurrection. There'll be another one 1,000 years later. It doesn't mean you completely missed the train. And I suspect that might be why Yeshua is saying it's better to be hot or cold than to be lukewarm. Because if you're completely cold, you're still kind of going toward the destination that you've chosen. You chose to be completely wicked, and you're happy with completely wicked. You don't want light. You don't want truth. You just don't want those things. You want yourself. You want the sheep to be God. But what about these who they do have that identity? They have an element of righteousness in them. They weren't all in. They still had a lot of idolatry mingled inside of them that they didn't want to release. So it could be that out in this wilderness, like the Israelites who fell, they rebelled, they revolted, they did not enter the land. It could be that they're still going to be resurrected, but it's at the second resurrection, which to me, it's actually the third, because I look at Yeshua's as the first, but maybe like there's a pre-wilderness, there's a pre-resurrection. Maybe it's resurrection 1A and 1B. But this resurrection after 1,000 years, there's still another judgment. But see, those who came out of the wilderness and into the land, they were already judged. They made it under the shepherd's rod at the first resurrection. But those who couldn't be reckoned under the rod, they had come out of the, I put out of the wilderness, that's not, they had come out to the wilderness, but they did not go in to the land. And, maybe at the second resurrection, there's still that opportunity. I don't know how that would look. I can't even begin to tell you what happens at the second resurrection, how those things are sorted out. I don't guess it's my job. But he says, if you have a part in that first resurrection, if you go out to the wilderness and then you refuse to revolt and rebel against the bond of the covenant, then blessed and holy are you, because you would be reckoned for that first resurrection and then be part of that messianic regime, that messianic kingdom that will rule and reign for 1,000 years. And man, what a time to overcome, because for 1,000 years, we won't have that evil inclination. Satan's going to be bound for 1,000 years, be way easier to rule and to govern and to manage and just to be around people. If you just contrast the wrath that's on earth today with Satan being bound for 1,000 years, how different people would be. I think we can appreciate that. So that's what I added to last night's, because I felt like it belonged there in that context. So let's get back to our fig tree and the grapevines. Going back in, telescoping it from Moses and Aaron to Joshua and Eleazar as idea with the two circumcisions. So now we're going to circle back again. We're not done with that plague of 3 days and 3 nights of darkness, because it was a little glimpse into what was coming next with the 10th plague. There's going to be death. And at least for the Israelites, there's going to be resurrection. They're going to embark upon the Exodus. They're going to be able to arise and come away. It's thought that the unrepentant Israelites were those unripe figs. We see those again in Revelation as being compared to stars falling out of the sky, descendants of Abraham. Stars are the symbols of that, but they just got blown away. The rabbis say in the 3 days of darkness in Egypt. And so the repentant Israelites were those ripe figs. They were leaving as like sacrifices, gifts, first fruits, prepared to dwell in the presence of Adonai. They were the fragrance of the grapevines during their time of pruning, which they're relating to the circumcision as the pruning, applying the blood to the doorpost and to the lintels. And Maxine sent me this. We went over this last night. It just kind of adds to the idea that Yeshua, he smells. When he administers justice, he smells the fragrance. And so for some, there's an aroma from death to death, and for others, that aroma from life to life. And again, if you think of those being able to sniff in the darkness, what that would be like to smell the grapevines blossoming, to smell the ripe figs in the darkness, so that they would have the light of Yeshua. But the rebels and the revolters, they would have had a different odor, right? So the lesson is that no matter what the nation of our exile is, we can repent, we can give up that fragrance of a circumcised heart, we can apply the blood of the Lamb so that we're hidden from the wrath of the Lamb. And here's what it says, taking us back to the blossoms. Exodus 12:23 says, "For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians. But when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you." And I've heard arguments before, was this literally the Holy One himself who harvested the firstborn, or was it the death angel? And I suspect from the context of this verse, the answer is yes, that he himself was present, but yet the destroyer, the death angel, literally did the harvesting, in the same way that the angels will come to collect the righteous. Like Yeshua said in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, the angels came, they got Lazarus. It said an angel came and got Moses. But it could be that the Holy One himself, his presence was there to protect. How was it? I think that blood on the doorpost definitely played a role, because if the blood was not on the doorpost, then his presence would not be there in order to prevent the destroyer from going into that house. So let's look at the doorposts here. The 2 doorposts, it says in the text there of Exodus 12:23, he says, "Shte mezuzot." Shte mezuzot. That means the 2 doorposts. And you all know what a mezuzah is, right? I don't necessarily want to rip one off my wall to show you, but if you don't know what a mezuzah is, probably one of our good homeroom moms or dads could pull a link off the internet for you and paste it into the chat box, and you'd be able to click on it and see examples of mezuzahs, or just Google mezuzah, and you'll see all sorts of creative mezuzot for the door. But there was 2. There needed to be 2 mezuzot, blood applied to both doorposts and up on the lintel. We don't often, sweetie, don't snore so loud. Oh, that was you. You don't snore. The lintel, hamashkof in Hebrew, the shoresh of it is shakaf. Let's look first at the lintel, then we'll get into why the two mezuzot and what does that have to do with the beast and Revelation, and what does it have to do with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So we're going to go back to the shoresh of the lintel, which is shakaf. You can see here the first three mentions. I just pulled up the first three of shakaf so that you could see the context. And when you say, how do I study? Like this, just like this. When you have a question about a particular word, you can go onto a search engine. This is taken out of Blue Letter Bible. There's other good ones out there. And you'll click the little box that says by verse instead of just listing by paragraph. It'll list by verse. And then this one has the tools over to the left. You can hover over there and pop up different translations of it. Interlinear is what you're going for a lot of the times, so that you can find the shoresh. In this case, when I pulled it up by verse, it goes ahead and lists the shoresh there in the kind of the red where you see H. H stands for Hebrew. If you see G, that's for Greek. You're going to find that in the New Testament. And you can click on that and it'll take you to the more specific Strong's entry and Gesenius concerning that particular shoresh or root word. And look at this. It says that shakaf, the shoresh of lintel, we've been looking at how many times the number 3 keeps popping up, and it's going to pop up more because we're going to look at the 3 trees that Jacob cut down in order to get the flocks to mate. And it's going to be 3 days after this incident with Lavan. But I'm giving away next week, aren't I? But this shoresh is going to occur 3 times in these 3 verses in Genesis, Bereshit. And look at the context. That's why I want you to see how I do what I do. I'll pull it up. And I'm not just looking for the word, I'm looking for the context, what's happening around this verse, not this verse in isolation. What's happening around this verse? And we just mentioned Lot and Sodom, right? Well, Genesis 18:16 is going to use shakaf, which is the root of a lentil where the blood had to go. And it says, then the man rose up from there and looked down. They didn't just look, they looked down. And that's what lentil is. Did I pass it up? I think maybe I did. It means to look down at something. Perfect context right here. The men, these angels, they rose up from there and looked down. Well, when they rose up, just imagine what level, what realm they might have been in, because they're looking down towards Sodom. And Abraham was actually walking with them to send them off when they rose up. Next, what's happening? It's going to be Abraham looking down, the same root for lentil. He looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the surrounding area. And behold, he saw the smoke of the land ascended like the smoke of a furnace. Okay, both of these are within the same story. And they have to do with the destruction, the judgment and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And in that judgment, it comes with the action of looking down. Right? We're looking down at the earth. The men rose up and they looked down. What did Abraham do? He looked down. Or was that Abraham? Was that Lot? I can't remember. Somebody looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah. The idea here is Oh, I wish you guys could see out my window right now. The most beautiful red fox. Anyway, little foxes, right? Spoil the vines. He wasn't a little one. At any rate, judgment. Now, this third mention is in Genesis 26:8. It says, now it came about when he had been there a long time that Avimelech, king of the Philistines, looked down. There's the shoresh, shakaf, the same as lintel. He looked down through a window and saw them, and behold, Isaac was caressing his wife, Rivka. Well, obviously they're not brother and sister, because he sees Isaac doing something that married couples do with one another. How he was doing that, we don't need to know. He just can tell by looking that the bridegroom is loving his wife. And what do we know about Avimelech? That there was a judgment coming down. He was a dead man if he didn't get rid of Rebecca. The same way that Avimelech was a dead man if he didn't get rid of Sarah, because the curse that came on all his house. And so Avimelech sees this happening again. He's like, oh my goodness, a curse on my house. I could lose my life. I mean, anybody could have taken her. And it would have destroyed my kingdom. So what's happening here? Again, judgment to destruction. What you see outside the window is going to be judged. It's going to pass under the shepherd's rod. And so in the case of this last one, it kind of brings it together, whereas the first two, you can see Sodom and Gomorrah, they did not, the reckoning under the rod, that was their destruction. But here we've got Avimelech actually looking down. He's about to be the one under judgment. He's about to lose his life, where at the very same time, Isaac is with his wife, Rebecca. So there's kind of a flip of the script right here, that the script can be flipped. And so the blood being applied to the lintel, again, you've got judgment that's coming for some, but depending on how this thing with the shepherd's rod goes, you might be the bride of Isaac. You might be the bride of Messiah. You might be more than brother and sister. But impending death, Avimelech could have died. Somebody in the land could have died if they touched her inappropriately. So how am I doing on time? Not great. Okay, so let's look. I took this out of one of my workbooks, workbook 4, because it has to do with threshold ritual slaughter. Where would they have slaughtered these lambs in Egypt if they didn't have a temple? If they didn't have a tabernacle, where would these lambs have been slaughtered? They would have been slaughtered at their own threshold. That was the custom, because there is a threshold covenant. So I'm just going to read you this out of workbook 4 to show you how long this ritual persisted among Assyrian Christians, also called the Nestorians, who were thought to be converts under Thomas, that they were Jews in places like Iran, Iraq, Turkey, and then Thomas apparently spearheaded the missionary journeys up in that area. And these Jews in that area converted to Christianity, and they actually maintained the Aramaic language to this day. Anyway, it says, as late as the 1800s, Christian missionaries to the isolated Assyrian Christians in northern Iran, Iraq, and Turkey observed their continuation of threshold ritual slaughter, and were interested in this because of the lintels and the doorposts. These were likely descendants of the exiled northern tribes, because this is the area where Scripture places them, or at least their last known destination. And so this is quoting from Asahel Grant's book. He was one of the missionaries who went to this area. He said, no general description could better answer to the sacrifices of the Nestorians, both as regards their object and the manner of performing them. They are usually offered to return thanks for God's benefits or to obtain new favors from him, as for instance, the recovery of a sick friend, their own restoration to health. The animal is usually slain before the door of the church. Usually before the door of the church. They could be their personal homes too. I don't know if this excerpt says that. But it says a little of the blood is often put upon the door or lintels. As all who are present may partake of the sacrifice, it is sometimes spoken of as a charitable offering, but it is often eaten by the person who offers it, together with his more immediate friends. It is regarded by all as an offering acceptable to God. In some cases, the animal is laid before the door of the offerer. Yeah, it does say that. And a portion is sent to every house in the village. You share in the sacrifice, and therefore you become bonded to whatever it is that this animal is signifying. The Nestorians regard these sacrifices as a remnant of their former Jewish rites, and those Jews of whom I have inquired on the subject say they are part of their own rites, which the Nestorians have retained since their conversion from Judaism, while they have departed from the law in more important matters. In other words, the Jews that lived, close to them were not impressed that they were still carrying on what they considered Jewish ritual sacrifice. It says those who entered to partake of the meal made from this animal were considered to have entered into covenant with that family and their God. As a type of the altar, the door signifies the opening through which the Holy Spirit moves to investigate who lives within. Are the inhabitants of the house in covenant with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Or have they hopped to a different decision and halted there? And hopping is pasuch. If it sounds like Pesach, it's because it's the same root. It means to hop or to skip over. And so with Pesach, it's a play on words. It's not just that the death angel hops over the house, but it's that it's usually used like with a bird hopping from branch to branch. And so they've hopped to a position and maintained the position. When you put the blood on the doorpost and on the lintel, you have hopped to a decision and you're not going to hop again. You're holding your position right there. And if you will hop to that decision, then the death angel hops over your house or skips. And so there's the idea of you can hop, but then you have to make a decision. You're in or you're out. That's why Yeshua says there's no lukewarm here. It's you're going to hop to this branch or this branch. Those who hop to a different decision and a different covenant with a different God are subject to one or more of the four altered judgments. And remember, those are wild beast, famine, sword, and plague. Those in covenant with Adonai have a visitation with Yeshua and the Father through the protection of his Passover covenant meal. And that's like a renewal every year. When we, even though we can't literally take the Passover lamb to the temple, it's still a renewal, a remembrance in a wilderness, wherever we are in our Egyptian wilderness. It's still a renewal of that bond of covenant that says we're hanging on out here. This meal involves both the spirit and the flesh. For the spirit of Elohim inside Adam, or mankind, has mastered the flesh by conforming to the nature of Messiah Yeshua, the spotless lamb. That's what that's symbolizing. But the idea here is the animal for this covenant meal is slaughtered at a door. Now, what has changed when they start slaughtering it at the opening of the tabernacle, or they start slaughtering it in the temple? They're still doing the same thing. It's just moved from the personal house, the door of the personal house, to the door of the tabernacles, the Patech, the opening of the tabernacle, and then in the temple, you're basically bringing it up to the doors of the Holy One and slaughtering that Passover lamb there. But you put that blood on the door or on the lintels, and it's going to say with the mezuzot, with the doorposts, it's saying, I'm not rebelling against your commandments. I'm not revolting in my wilderness. I agree to this bond of the covenant. When you put it on the lintel, what you have agreed to in this covenant meal now kind of becomes that force. It's going to look down. It's going to see the judgment outside, but not inside. So you can see how the mezuzot that you put on your doorpost today is derived from those ideas, all the way from this ancient practice of taking your animal and slaughtering it at the doorpost of your house, and then inviting others to share that meal with you. That's pretty much mirroring what happened at the Passover, that you had to be able to consume the lamb completely. So you're going to have to share that animal until nothing remains. And everybody who eats of that animal has now entered into covenant with you and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is a great reason, guys, for you to start planning your Passover. People don't always understand. We get caught up in the details of how to do it, and sometimes we forget why we really do it. And every year we can learn more about why we ritually do it. It's a type of threshold ritual slaughter. It's an annual remembrance in our wilderness where he's reckoning with us. He's checking to see who goes under the rod, because by the time we get to the fifth feast, to the Feast of Trumpets, it's going to be important, because it'll have to do with the resurrection. And I suspect if you're bound over at Pesach, I don't think just because there's a summer in between, I don't think your behavior is going to change between Pesach and then Yeshua says, pray, that your flight be not in certain seasons for a particular reason. But there's no reason why who you are should change between Pesach and the fall feasts. So let's wrap this up here for this week. There is such a thing as a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew. Now, I've read to you from the Dutile version before. I've got a full copy of that. There's at least 3 copies of some kind of Hebrew Gospel of Matthew floating around out there. This particular Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, it's not a full document. There's only fragments of it. But how we know it existed is because the church fathers, who could be a little hostile to Jewish believers, and well, actually more than a little hostile, they were very hostile to Jewish believers, much less Jews who weren't believers in Messiah Yeshua. But Jerome, Origen, Eusebius, all the biggies back then, they referred or quoted from the gospel according to the Hebrews. So it's not the same as the Baal Shem Tov or the Dutile version or any other known Hebrew version of Matthew, but they have pieced together those fragments based on what the church fathers quoted. And what I found among those fragments was that instead of saying the veil of the temple was rent at Yeshua's death, it says an enormous lintel in the temple was broken and divided. And so assuming the veil was attached to it, both statements could actually be true. The Hebrews, the Jews, were focusing on what was it telling us that the lintel was broken? Judgment was broken. Yeshua's death broke the judgment. The blood of the Passover lamb broke the judgment that we would have been subject to. the destruction that we would have been subject to, where we would have been an outside and not an inside. But we came inside the lintel, and the lintel protected us from the death angel. What do the Gentiles focus on? They focus more on the veil. So I think both are valid. Both are teaching us something. So perhaps because we know the Holy One inhabits his holy mountain, his eyes are always upon it, his presence is always there. So if the veil and the lintel of the temple were torn, broken, it's telling us that there is a particular judgment that had been decreed from the Holy One, who was looking down, and Yeshua stepped in. He shed his blood, the lamb's blood. And it's better to apply his blood to the lintel than to endure his wrath. But think of that journey that he made, because we're supposed to put the mezuzah on the doorpost of our house and up on our gates, it says, like the gates of the city. So imagine Yeshua having to pull that dead tree through the streets of Jerusalem. It's his blood on that tree that's going to stand between us and the judgment of the death angel. He's not just going to save us. He has a promise of resurrection for us. And after I thought about it, I thought, what if, as Yeshua is coming through whichever gate he comes out of the city to go to the place of the skull, what if his blood literally dropped on the threshold of that gate? What if his blood literally was smeared on one of those gates as he's coming out of Jerusalem to be crucified? I think there's a pretty good chance he left some blood on that threshold, that he literally made it a threshold covenant, that the blood of the lamb was literally smeared on those. I can just see him stumbling under that weight and trying to support himself on a gate before he makes that final leg of the journey. And so I'll leave you right here. Let's see. Yeah, we'll go to the mezuzah next week. Here's a cross-reference for those who are new. If you've begun class since the Torah portion Kitavo of 2020, there's some more good information on the mezuzah in Kitavo. There's a part 1 and a part 2. I think when I did it for the general public, I called it the International Mezuzah. But if you go back through the YouTube files, it might pop up as the Beast and the Mezuzah. I don't remember what I did for the class versus what I did for the general public, but it should come up under one of those two titles, and it's 2 parts. So if you can find that, that will really enhance, I think, your grasp of the mezuzah before we go into the next week's lesson, where we specifically get into the mezuzah and the beast and the tree and all that. Again, what does it mean to arise, my love? What does it mean to learn from the parable of the fig tree? Okay, so stop recording.